You can only hear your colleges and graduate schools and stuff listed for so many times before you think, oh, does anyone care? It is an honor to be here today and a pleasure to be with you, and really an honor to join this distinguished company of speakers. I'm impressed with this program and delighted to know that it is happening here at ISU. And I am particularly pleased that you have chosen this topic this year that the Institute has of commemorating 200 years of this remarkable document, the Bill of Rights. As you can imagine, this topic of freedom of the press, of course, means a great deal to me, but I have to choose my words fairly carefully. If I were to describe this year as the time when we as a people celebrate the 200th birthday of the Bill of Rights, I might be ill-advised, because celebration is not what everyone is feeling, especially about free press or free speech issues. It's been a time of real challenge in our nation in looking at these issues, and a survey last year taken by the American Society of Newspaper Editors showed that the vast majority of respondents would in fact not vote to ratify First Amendment were it put before the people today. I think there are many reasons for this, and among them certainly are growing concerns about privacy and a kind of a fear that we have in our nation today that we're losing control over things, a desire to institute a little more control, and a feeling that you can do that sometimes by not knowing the bad news or by kind of containing it, which makes secrecy fairly attractive. I think the Reagan administration, the environment was conducive to this growing comfort with secrecy. But we in the media have certainly contributed as well, partly in a kind of an arrogant tone, a kind of a tendency that we have, I think, to wrap the First Amendment around ourselves as if it were ours and we are untouchable when we are encased in it. And I want to elaborate more on that and on some of the consequences for our society, which I see as a retreat from openness. But first I want to say that I actually feel quite hopeful at this moment in time, partly because I believe, I guess, to put it simplistically, in a kind of a cyclical trend in history, as many people do and many people don't. And I think we've gone through a period where we thought maybe secrecy was the solution. I think many of the things that have gone on in our recent history as a nation, and certainly as a state and locally, perhaps may increase the public affection for accountability and the public enthusiasm for open records and open meetings and for access to information. I think when we have an Iowa Trust scandal, or when we see lapses in ethics, such as I would argue that we have seen recently in the Iowa legislature, or become aware of recently, more aware of, or concerns about police brutality, that these will feed the public enthusiasm for accountability. But before I come to the hopeful part of my speech, I want to tell you why I am deeply concerned about this nation's lack of enthusiasm for openness. First of all, I thought I would talk about a number of pressures that I feel as a newspaper editor, and that I think all people in the media do, against printing things and against sharing information. There are the fearful, cautious tendencies of the press. There's squeamishness and prudishness and timidity and an overdeveloped fear of offending someone. There are the legal pressures and the growing concerns about privacy. There are commercial pressures in a time of economic challenge. Now, I want to talk about some of these because I bet you anything, a lot of the people in the room are thinking, are you kidding? The press is entirely too willing to be offensive. But I don't think so. And I want to talk about some of the things that don't get in the papers typically, which goes to my theme of what you don't know will hurt you. First, let's take what I would argue to be the don't offend anyone tendencies. I have discovered, in fact, that all that I was brought up to believe in about setting out to please people had to be cast aside when I took this job. Popularity is not to be for the newspaper editor, and that's probably as it should be. But there are good reasons why we feel squeamish about printing certain things. Clearly, the newspaper ought to be an exemplary user of the language. And I, as a mother of a 7-year-old and a 13-year-old, do understand that young people read newspapers, not in a great enough number, I would argue, but that young people in many families, bless their hearts, do read newspapers. And certainly I wouldn't want to turn the Des Moines Register's front page into a blitz of obscenities. But I would like to look at some of the particulars that I have myself become aware of and at the consequences. Some of you who are readers of the Registers may have noticed not enormous, but I think consequential story a couple of months ago about a much respected judge in Iowa who told a joke at a judges' convention, which many people in the room found to be offensive. A couple of judges walked out of the room. And when our reporter heard of this and heard of the fact that many people were upset about it, he wrote a story in which he included the joke. And the story went to the editor, the city editor, one of the people on the city desk, who took it out, quite understandably. Why offend people? It was a vulgar joke, not very funny to most people. And then the reporter appealed to me. He said, I think we should put the joke in a story. It's more than just titillation. It's more than a gratuitous inclusion of some offense. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, now, we typically make a decision to keep something offensive out of the paper because we want to protect the public from this offense. I think, actually, that often we're protecting two other people, ourselves, from some people's anger at the joke in the paper. But more to the point, the person, the public servant in this case, who told the joke. We decided to go ahead and put the joke in the paper, and it definitely strikes me that this is the right thing to do. Precisely because in our society we have to believe that we can trust people with information, that we can trust people to make decisions. And if you were to read this newspaper story and it said, well, this judge told a joke that some people found offensive and some people left the room, and then the questions that come up in your mind are, what would I have found the joke offensive? Do I think the judge did something wrong, or do I think that the people in the room reacted unreasonably? The public servant in this case is the person who is being protected from the consequences or the lack of consequences of his action. I've been thinking of another very troubling one recently, and this is the case of, do you remember a few months ago when there were many stories that used these words? A high-ranking Pentagon official was outed by a gay rights newspaper. Well, let us dare to say his name. Pete Lewis is the man's name, and he's the Assistant Secretary of Defense. Now you may ask, why should I mention this man's name? He is a professional who's simply attempting to do his job. What does his sexual orientation have to do with anything? It's a valid question. It should always be the question that a newspaper editor asks, but I think there's a fairly good answer. And I must say that respectable newspapers, including my own, didn't use Pete Williams' name. It wasn't in the Wire stories that were reporting on this incident. The answer that I would give as to why in the world we should mention the man's name is that it came up at a time of great controversy when gay and lesbian members of the armed forces were being forced out of Operation Desert Storm. And in fact, indeed, over the past 4 years, tens of thousands of members of the military have been forced out. Now, it is not up to me to judge what you might view to be the connection between these two things. You may think the whole thing is offensive and want no part of it. You may think that knowing that an Assistant Secretary of Defense would himself be gay and would be a leader in an organization which is forcing other people out for the very same human identity is wrong, or you may think that none of it deserves any attention at all. It shouldn't be up to me to keep the information from you that might be useful to you in making a decision. Another area, cause of death, and this is the hardest one of all. Surely the most grievous situation for a newspaper editor is to be contacted by a loved one whose husband or wife or daughter or mother or father has died, and to tell us that they wish we would not say something in the obituary. But an obituary is a news story by any other name. And it is amazing how many people offer all sorts of things that they wish we wouldn't put in that news story. I shortly after I got here, I had a call from a prominent family in Dubuque. The banker, in this case, it was a prominent banker in Dubuque, had died. And he and his sister had been feuding for years before the death. And he had requested quite specifically that his sister not be listed among the survivors. And the Dubuque Telegraph-Herald, it's not cricket to put down your competitors, but what can I say, full disclosure, went along with this and didn't list the sister among the survivors. And of course, people in Dubuque knew this family, and I think that the question of credibility is very much in play. The family were horrified that I would not be equally responsive. A much more substantive issue with obituaries is the question of cause of death. Many newspapers in this country do not put a cause of death. It goes back a long way to the days when cancer, of all things, was seen to be shameful as a cause of death. We're a long way from that, but only in the case of cancer. What about AIDS? There were, in the beginning years of AIDS as a presence in our society, most newspapers refused to list it. Families didn't want it listed. And I would argue strongly that our sensitivity in this case, certainly what was seen to be sensitivity, greatly contributed to society's ability to blind themselves to this illness in our midst. And I noticed personally, maybe I was looking for it, that while I was living in New York during the period of time when AIDS was really burgeoning there, the fact that the New York Times began listing AIDS as a cause of death had a real impact on people. They would read the story and think, now, so-and-so was a fine set designer, so-and-so was a distinguished playwright, and it humanized what had been a faceless villain for people. There is simply no question that when we can put a face on something, when we can put flesh on something, it has far greater power for us. I was mentioning this, my cause of death dilemma, in a speech I gave at Stanford a few months ago. And in the question and answer period, a man about my age stood up and he said, "You really have no idea what it is you're asking for when you ask that newspapers list causes of death." And I am grateful indeed that our local newspaper did not list the cause of death when my stepson killed himself. A high school senior, a gifted young man, committed suicide, and my wife was grievously saddened, and it would only have contributed to her sadness had this newspaper listed anything other than, as they did, deceased. And I probably made a kind of an ineffectual response and spoke of my sadness, my sorrow, my recognition that this could indeed increase his sadness, but my argument that society is far better off knowing many things, including the number of young people who commit suicide, and yes, putting faces on them. But the question and answer period ended, and a much more compelling answer came my way in the form of a young woman who was a student at Stanford who said to me, "I went to high school with this man's stepson, and he was one of the most popular people in the school, and no one could believe it. When he died, we didn't understand, we didn't know what had happened. We wanted to be able to grow from our pain and grieve together. And we picked up the newspaper, and the newspaper said simply, deceased." And she said, "We learned two things in that. One is that adults really don't like to tell the truth when it's a hard truth. And the second was, you surely can't count on the newspaper to give it to you." That's not the lesson we should be teaching young people, and it's not the lesson that we as a society should feel comfortable espousing. Again, I would ask, whom are we protecting? Now, obviously, these things become very difficult, and I had a sort of a personal confrontation with this. You remember maybe 18 months ago when the rap group 2 Live Crew had the tape "Nasty as They Want to Be," and the record store owner in Florida, I believe it was prosecuted. I happen to have Donald Call, who's many of you know, a columnist at the Register and works in our Washington bureau, and our Washington bureau chief in town, and we were having a dinner at our home, and my husband and I and Call and Anthony and a couple of other friends were talking about this, and we were kind of saying to one another, "Have you heard it? They say it's just really misogynist, what do you think it says?" And nobody knew, we're all clueless. And in walks my 12-year-old daughter, rosy-cheeked, straight A student, healthy as they come, polite and everything. She walks in the door. She's been at a party down the street. Yes, I know the parents. Yes, I know every kid who was there. And she hears what we're talking about, and she said, "Oh, we played that tonight at the party." And of course, we're sort of, people are going, what does it say to my 12-year-old? Now, I realize that this is a very difficult subject for people, and people legitimately have different ways of handling this with their children. I welcomed an opportunity to be able to say to her, what did it say? Let's think about this. What does it mean to you? But I also was struck by the irony of that having happened to me personally. I would never have printed the lyrics of this. I'm sure I could personally barely have uttered them, although some would call me foul-mouthed. But, it made me wonder, all these people who call me and say, don't you realize that my 12-year-old reads your newspaper? They should be listening to what their 12-year-old hears. And should we not, in the media, perhaps be helping them understand it? Not by some front page piece, but maybe I should, at the time, have written an op-ed piece that said, look, you might want to be aware of this. And we could have accompanied it with warning labels. But it's a very difficult dilemma. And I'm not sure we in the press have made the right choices. Now, while we're on this... don't we offend everyone all the time? Let me address the current issue, which I'm sure many of you are distressed about. Do we care about anything in the press about Bill Clinton except his alleged extramarital affairs and now his alleged draft dodging? I have been observing my fellow editors in the American press responding to this, and it's interesting to see how they respond. My good friend and one-time boss and admirable colleague Max Frankel, who is the editor of the New York Times, has been quite assertive about, I argue, patting himself on the back. I talked to him about this, so I'm not speaking behind his back, about saying this is a story which is just not of the quality of the New York Times, and so they've been sort of burying little pieces of it skeletally in the innards of the New York Times. And he said, because look at the questionable veracity of the source. Well, yes, I understand that, and I don't take that lightly. But I said to Max, were you as torn up about the questionable veracity of Ollie North and Elliot Abrams and Robert Gates? Or is it really the subject of this one that makes us uncomfortable? And of course it should, but we as a nation have this kind of deep, divided, sort of, on the one hand, prurient, on the one hand, puritanical feel, I think. And I feel strongly that this may be yet one more chapter, one more convulsion in the getting to somewhere more reasonable. People say, but newspapers used to be decorous. I mean, newspapers used to be less decorous in many ways. And we as a society have gone through this difficult coming to terms in lots of different ways. I mean, I give you the other people have alluded to this. Was it Grover Cleveland who was said to have had an illegitimate child, as they say? That's a term that makes some people unhappy. Anyway, a child out of wedlock. And everybody knew it. And the current phrase was, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. I mean, then we went through a period of where we didn't allude to these things, and then later we find out that Kennedy had mafia malls in the White House. I mean, who's to say what is best and what is not best? My argument would be, yes, I think we should be able to elect people to public office who have strayed from absolute marital fidelity. But that's what I think. Some people don't think it. And I would hope that the way we get through this convulsion is to have more information. I will not be a bit surprised if we pin down very precisely the source of this as a political source on the Republican National Committee. Not that the Democrats wouldn't do it, it's just that in this instance it would be the Republicans. And then people will have yet more information on which they can base these judgments. Let me turn, and not that I will have persuaded everyone in the room, and we will have a question and answer period in which you can seek to raise my consciousness. But let me turn from that sector of things, sort of the offending people ones, to the privacy ones, because this is an interest that is increasingly strong in American society, and I understand that. I've got to talk a little, sort of like this isn't very respectable, but a rock star who has one song, and you've got to go back and sing it. I've got to talk about rape names a little bit, because that's certainly something we have thought a lot about at the Des Moines Register. We ran a series of the rape of Nancy Ziegenmeyer, who was a Grinnell housewife, a remarkable woman who was just consistently forthright, I believe, and and we won a Pulitzer Prize for public service for having done this. The exceptional thing here is that Ziegenmeier wanted to tell her story and be named and be photographed. Her whole being was resisting the urge of behaving like a proper rape victim, which is to say, go in the corner and be quiet and don't tell anyone lest they think ill of you. And I understand why newspaper editors in the 70s, mostly in response to feminists, took this step. But I feel strongly that we as a society need to be aware of the cost of this step, that is, for newspaper editors in this one case of adult victims only. There are child abuse questions that are very different. Obviously, the press, society in general, has a responsibility to protect children. But in only this case, only this crime against adults, do we do this humane, I would say, courtly step of protecting them. And I would ask you to think about the next time someone like this blue blob who alleged that William Kennedy Smith had raped her comes out behind that anonymity and speaks up. What they say, I want to take back my life. I want to reclaim my life. Now, is it, many people say, but it should be the rape victim's choice. I understand that. In fact, at the register, we do not name rape victims without their choice. I think it would be without their consent. I think it would be extremely difficult in this environment to do anything but damage by doing that. But I'll tell you, if the newspaper on any given day were to ensure that no one in that newspaper was in any way uncomfortable with the way in which his or her name was used, if I instructed my staff to go forth and absolutely assure yourself that any source of information is comfortable with the way we're putting the newspaper together, the newspaper would make Swiss cheese look solid. I mean, there is no ability. You can't have a credible newspaper that way. I guess one of the things I think we need most to think about in this privacy concern is that we have, on our way to adulthood, most of us, come to see that, in fact, there is a price sometimes to truth, to forthrightness, to candor. There is often an individual victim. And I understand society's desire to focus on that victim, but I would ask, at what cost to society do we protect individual victims? At what cost of ignorance, of an inability to deal with difficult issues around us? Finally, I want to talk about commercial pressures, which are everywhere. As you know, the economy is tough, and while newspapers have made a lot more money than most businesses would be able to, they also are feeling the pressures, and when advertisers exert pressures, they're strong. I don't know how many of you saw in the Wall Street Journal last week front page story on this very question, and it was talking about the Oregonian, a respected newspaper in Portland, which had stopped the presses and pulled thousands of copies, destroyed thousands of copies of a newspaper which was already in the press run and destined to go out, because it had a story on how to sell your home without the aid of a real estate agent. And guess who didn't like this? Big advertisers, real estate companies. Now, I mean, we ran a similar one in the Metro Home and Real Estate tab last year, and we caught hell for doing it. I mean, advertisers don't want that kind of environment. I, in my relentlessly optimistic way, am just sure that there is the potential to say to an advertiser, you want to pay X amount of money to be in the Des Moines Register because what you want is to capture the reader's eye. And if you are part of a rich environment in which there is good, solid, reliable, credible information, you'll have a lot better shot at having your advertising mean something. Whereas if I put you in this bland pap, who's going to read you? But we have to do that. We have to believe that that's true, and we have to try to educate and work with people. I mean, the number of newspapers today that will, just look at them when you think about it, that will run an automotive news section, and it will be nothing but glory for the American car maker. And that's fine, that has its place, but let's say I want to run rebates. I mean, you as a reader might well like to know, what are the rebates that are being offered at car dealers in central Iowa next week, in case you're going out and buying a car? Do you know how much the auto dealer would like to have that in the newspaper? this is a real conflict, and it's one that we need to acknowledge and that we need to be open about and have debates about. Now, while we're talking about losing money, this does happen. I mean, we had a case of a Toyota dealer in Des Moines last year who was having a terrible time with all sorts of complaints against him of racism and sexism, and we covered these. I might say that other media in Des Moines didn't seem to make room for these complaints. But he noticed that we were the only ones covering them, and he pulled a significant amount of ads. That is understandable. It's an understandable reaction on his part. I would argue that not only am I saying this to be self-congratulatory, but because you, as citizens who want to believe you have a credible news source, whatever it may be, I think should be concerned about this sort of thing. My kind introducer here mentioned the PETA thing. I thought I would give you one little update. You probably know, unless you were on Mars, that the Register, my publisher, Charles Edwards Jr., decided to take an ad which was deeply offensive to most normal people, which compared the slaughter of livestock to the grisly murders by Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee. And we lost 1,000 subscribers and hundreds of thousands of dollars over this. And I think that Charlie made the right decision. I wish we had been able to explain it better to people. It's amazing how much explaining we did after it and how many meetings we had with the beef producers and the pork producers. And anyway, last week, Charlie went to the Pork Producers Convention, something he's taken to doing with some regularity lately. And lo and behold, Harold Trask, who is former president of the National Pork Board, and stood up and said, I want you to know that I thought this was the most disgusting thing that I have ever seen a newspaper do, to run this ad. And he's speaking to 400 hog producers. And he says, after that ad ran and we shrieked and screamed justifiably, Geneva and Charlie came to see us at the Iowa Pork Producers, National Pork Producers headquarters, and we had a good session. And he said, Charlie sat there and he said, here's what I think. It is not my job to keep information or assertions or ideas from Iowans. I think Iowans can make up their own minds. I think they can figure out what they believe and what they don't believe. And in the end, I think that's what we have to, that has to be our guiding rule. And Trask said, I listened to that and I thought about it. And then I thought about it some more. And he said, actually, now I think I agree with him. It was a terrible ad, but it was the right thing for Charlie to do. Now, there are plenty of people out there who don't agree with him. And believe me, I know that. I've heard from all of them. I got plenty of letters, although my favorite letter was from some wonderful gentleman who said to me, take heart, Ms. Overholser. My experience is the people who cancel the Register steal out in the dark of night to buy single copies. I hope so, but I know some of them don't, and some of them leave you because they're angry with you, and I can understand that. But I also know that there are plenty of people who do want to get unfettered information, even offensive ideas, and that people can be reminded of why, and that people can recognize the trouble with some of the sentiments I heard, especially during the rape names controversy, when I carried it one step further, not with any intention of using rape victims' names, but when I found out that the Des Moines Police Department was sporadically withholding the names of rape victims from the police reports, which meant that my reporter going down there, let's say there is a rash of rapes in Owl's Head in Des Moines. I send a cop reporter down there, a day reporter, night reporter, and they can see these things. And they wouldn't have written a story saying X was raped, but they would have written a story saying there were 3 rapes in the Owl's Head neighborhood, and this is something the public wants to know, or should want to know. And so I raised this, and the police chief, the lawyers began, my lawyer began to talk with the city lawyer, and it all went well until Ben Bali, who was the public information officer, went running to WHO and said, look at this, can you believe this? They're going to start using rape victims' names. I know what you're thinking. It's good for people in the media to be covered in the media because you sure have a good experience and you learn what it's like. And I certainly did because, WHO called the governor and he said, over my dead body. And they called Avison, who was in Miami, and he said, I'll reconvene the legislature. And I'm sitting there going, why? So the fact is, though, that you do have an interest in having this information made available. And I think that when I would hear people say, why should I, the police will protect me. Why should I question the police? Why should I question authority? That's the kind of thing I kept hearing again and again during that debate. Now, I am a great supporter of the police. I think Chief Mulder is a marvelous man. I think that the Des Moines Police Department that we're blessed to have them. But I also know they're human beings. They're imperfect. And when we in a democracy say, who am I to question the police? I am chilled at the sentiments around us. We believe in our ability to hold the government accountable, but we sometimes lose track of the fact that it's we who must do it. I was telling Mrs. Hamilton I'm going to a hearing today in which we are attempting to get a search warrant in the Lesage case of this little girl who was picked up in near Moulton School a few months ago. Search warrants really are supposed to be open, but increasingly the authorities are finding reasons to seal the search warrants, and in this case not only seal the search warrant, but seal the order sealing the search warrant. Now, I want you to think about this. The whole point of having public access to a search warrant is to have some kind of break on the police ability to go into a citizen's home. Now, this is something we ought to care about, not because we think the police are all out to get all of us, but because that's what we ought to care about in a democracy. And here we have a situation in which the county attorney is protecting the guy whose home was searched from the public right to know what the police reasoning was to search his home. There's something wrong here. That's not the way it ought to be. I believe that we do have growing secrecy on the part of government. When the Iowa law was passed in '84, asserting open records and open meetings, and there was a very short list of exceptions, and they grow every year. And there are all sorts of convenient reasons why they should grow. The legislators come up against something, and they think, well, it'll be easier to just make it secret. But that's the wrong solution in this system of government. We are a democracy, and we believe that we are a government of the people and by the people and for the people, and we cannot keep the people in the dark. I believe that we should, all of us, be worried about an era when a BCCI scandal catches us by surprise, or when the press in a war is treated like senior citizens on a package tour, when individuals can be heard to say, who am I, to question authority, to question my leaders. That is your job in this society. And you can't do it without knowledge. You can't be vigilant if you don't have the information. And there are lots of things keeping you from having that information. Part of it is our fault in the press. But part of it is the government's fault. And in the end, in either case, it's up to you to push for the solutions. If I could have one birthday wish for the First Amendment, can you hear me working up to the end here? It would be that you would yell at your newspaper editor for something that should have been in the newspaper and wasn't. And that would be a patriotic act. I'm going to shut up now and let you ask questions or have at me. And thank you for having me. Thanks a lot. Yes?
The biggest problem with, I guess, the mainstream media today is that it's not as if the mainstream media is close to corporate America. The mainstream media is corporate America. The media in this country is concentrated in the hands of a few corporations. Recently, a Soviet journalist in the time of Glasnost said, the difference between our propaganda and your propaganda is you believe yours. Which I think is quite accurate. And for example, the Des Moines Register, in terms of international coverage, I mean, to me, it's comical. I mean, it's quite comical. I read a lot of different newspapers, alternative newspapers, because I know I'm not going to get the information I need to keep me informed. the BCCI scandal, a perfect example. You had the CIA laundering drugs, having secret bank accounts. In that, if that happened in the Soviet Union, there would be headlines, it would be all over the place.
You're a little too enthusiastic about the Soviet press, but I take your rap on the American one.
But, you know, in the Persian Gulf War, classic time when McNeil and Lair, when McNeil turned to his colleagues and said, has the press adequately prepared the public for this war?
Well, I take your point. It's an important one. I differ with some of your assertions about it, but in fact, I think your argument just solidifies my contention. I could go on. I mean, when I was at the New York Times, I was on the editorial board there. I was writing about national security issues. I was telling the guy who was my boss, who was in town here for the caucuses, that I found it continually infuriating that the Times was so much a part of the establishment. We knew, I mean, every time that the president came to you with this window of vulnerability, or this weapon requires that weapon, and the whole, there were just, people would come in with their little briefcases and sit down and intone these things, and it was perfectly clear that you were supposed to look equally serious and ask this arcane detail and that arcane detail, and you kept thinking about the emperor without any clothes on, but you weren't supposed to really press on that. Now, so I accept that we are often orthodoxy bound. I don't think it's quite as nefarious as you would put it. I mean, for example, let's take the corporate one. I left the Des Moines Register when in 1985, this glorious family-owned indigenous newspaper was bought by America's largest newspaper-owning corporation. But I had my price. They brought me back as editor. Actually, I went to the New York Times, which is also a family-owned newspaper, and found that, family ownership doesn't guarantee independence. I admire the New York Times, and I use it partly just to say that our finest newspaper is also a captive of orthodoxy. But I think that the greatest ill of corporate journalism is not that the people won't tell the truth. It's that there becomes an increasing homogenization. I understand your point about our foreign news coverage. I wish I had a much bigger news hole. But I will tell you that I think our first responsibility has to be adequately to cover Des Moines and central Iowa and Iowa, because nobody else is going to do that. No one else is going to do that. And we haven't been doing a good enough job of it. The worst thing about corporate journalism, I've decided, is not the relentless bottom line pressure, which is damn bad. It's horrible. I mean, that's why my news hole is the way it is. That's why that I think we're increasingly going to turn. It's funny because there's so few women at the top of journalism, but there are tons of women at the bottom. It's going to be another pink-collar ghetto because we pay such crummy salaries. But anyway. The real ill is that corporations treat editors and publishers like interchangeable cogs. I would argue, despite what my mail says, I mean, anything I do, people write me and say, oh, you're turning the Register into USA Today. Well, I think if I took color and graphics and photos and everything out of the paper, that's what they'd say. But anyway, the point is that Gannett, just like other newspaper corporations, kind of moves its editors and publishers around. And we won't really know the impact of Gannett on the Des Moines Register until that starts happening. And blessedly, we still have, as a publisher, the man who is a member of the Coles family, who sort of, who does have his kids in the public schools here, and who does have his neighbor bawling him out if this or that happens. So I accept your point. The fact is, it is true. We are a very sleepy press many times, and I would simply say that you have added to my argument. Yes.
Along those same lines, I was really disappointed with the change. In which case, most of the Iowa news is on the front page of the paper. I didn't think too much of it. You explained in several editorials that this is part of a change we've been planned for a long time. But I was surprised when I went home to New York that my local Gannett newspaper had also made a similar change, in which case international press coverage was drastically reduced, and mostly it was just a local type of paper.
Is that Gannett Westchester?
Yes.
Well, they were never any kind of international or national paper, were they? I mean, you know them better than I do, but I can't. They were suburban newspapers.
It was a comparable change, I thought. So I was wondering, was this a Gannett organized change that happened here?
You spy, the person behind the screen. Huh? No, as a matter of fact, I came here and I would be glad to show you my speech. When I delivered it to my newsroom when I came here 3 years ago, I said, I have 3 strong concerns about this newspaper, but before I get to the concerns, my commitment is to continue its tradition and its heritage. But I'll tell you, if we don't think in newspapering about reaching people better, there won't be any pride for us to continue having. People are not reading newspapers. When I went into this business 20 years ago, 75% of Americans read a daily newspaper. It's 50% today. And among 18 to 34-year-olds, it's fewer than a third. Now, does that mean we should dumb it down and put Madonna on the front page? No. But it means we need to examine, are we reaching people? And the newspaper that doesn't examine the opportunity for change is making a fool of itself. But the three, to follow up on sticking with our heritage, were one, we need to be a better local newspaper. I mean Iowa, and I mean Central Iowa, and I mean Des Moines. The Tribune died in 1982, and we've never made up for it. And I go back to my point. I came back here from the New York Times. I spent 5 years overseas. I get that. I love international news. Iowans are a very progressive and outward-looking people. But my primary responsibility has got to be letting you know what's going on in Iowa, because the New York Times is sure not going to do that. Now, I did not, let me just finish this one point. I did not in any way decrease the news hole for international and national news. In fact, what I did was expand the news hole for local news. Your point about more local news on the front page is certainly true. But let me assure you that this was an entirely local decision, although it is surely true that newspapers across the country are recognizing that something happened during the days when we all decided to go into journalism. And, you know, it wasn't worth writing a story unless you could oust a president. You know, Watergate was great stuff, but the hell with what's going on over at the cop shop. That can't be the way we feel. You were going to say something.
Would you comment on the censorship press during the Gulf War, and more generally on the censorship that seems to have been exercised during our last few wars like Grenada and Panama?
Well, I was going to say, it really started with Grenada and Panama when the press just kind of succumbed and entered into this pool agreement. Some of my colleagues get mad at me when I say that. I wasn't part of the editors group then, but I was chair of the Freedom of Information Committee at the American Society of Newspaper Editors during the beginning of Operation Desert Storm, and we went and met with actually the aforementioned Pete Williams, and we're making these assertions that, you know, the public can't possibly have the information it needs. And they were essentially saying, look, this was a done deal. I mean, we agreed on pool coverage in Grenada. We agreed on pool coverage in Panama. Of course, unfortunately, it has become increasingly restricted. And we have consistently in the press made these charges. They've been pretty ineffectual so far, partly because we've done them ineffectually, perhaps, partly because the public overwhelmingly supports the notion of not having better access. Now, I don't think that's a hopeless cause. I think, you know, we need to make the case better. You never saw pictures of the ground war in Iraq. That's terrible. But you know, I mean, I know this to be true, and you know it to be true, and I also know that the polls showed that some overwhelming majority of American people thought it was absolutely appropriate that the press be kept out. Oh, it was like 75%. So I don't think that's hopeless, but I mean, as long as that is true, the Pentagon doesn't have a lot of trouble saying, now, unruly boys and girls, you know, this worked, the pool.
That's because that's all they heard in the press. That's all the people heard in the press. So why wouldn't they go along with that? If they don't hear any dissenting views.
That's a little overstated. I understand your point, but we ran plenty of dissenting opinions on the op-ed pages consistently throughout the war. We personally, I mean, the editorial policy of the Des Moines Register was against the war. And the fact is that the American public, I mean, if you think this is not true, you'd be amazed to find what are the overwhelming public opinions in this country about secrecy. They are consistently disheartening. And it's our job, all of us who get this true religion, to go out and speak about it. Who else you've had your hand up?
Just wanted to say I really applaud the taking the facts and getting a lot of the facts in, and also covering the local scene, because today's Des Moines Register is tomorrow's historical document. And those of us who...
Or fish wrap.
But if we're writing history, researching history, certainly we really rely on the Des Moines Register and other newspapers like it, because we can go other places and get the national news of that day, decades from now even, but we can't get the local information.
No, I appreciate you saying that. We really haven't been doing nearly as good a job as we should about that. You had something in the back.
Yeah, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Washington, D.C., reading the Washington Post every day during the Vietnam War. I think your coverage of the Gulf War last year was
Did you see the Washington Post coverage of the war?
It was a lot better than the one registered.
It was just a whole lot more of the same thing, and even more obvious in that regard, in my
The
opinion.
Register was showing pictures of Johnny going marching off the war, and the Register really wasn't covering all of the peace movements around this country. There are hundreds of papers that have sprung up in this country in response to the fact that the media has not covered these things. You asked me to do my patriotic right, okay, to confront you with what I think is wrong, but I don't think you're doing your patriotic job to go out and, you don't have to agree to these polls. Okay, I suggest you send somebody to listen to Ramsey Clark tonight, because Ramsey Clark got together with a couple other people who videotaped what was going on in Iraq during the time of the bombing. All you had to do was get in the car and go to Baghdad.
We did a story on that with Ramsey Clark.
The press,
I read that in the Register.
the press could have done that just as easily.
Your central point is that that war was abysmally covered. We are part of that. I accept your point. I would ask you to remember that there is more to giving the full picture of the war than covering peace groups. We did quite a little bit with peace groups, although not nearly as much as Johnny Goes Off to War. But the bigger, much more important question is really covering that war. And believe me, I did what I could during that time as the chair of the FOI committee at ASNE to make sure we had access. And we didn't have access. And certainly the Washington Post didn't have access. No one had access. And I agree with you that that is the unfortunate aspect.
Peter Arnett was in Baghdad. Peter Arnett was broadcasting out of Baghdad, and the press themselves.
Have you ever heard Peter Arnett talk about the American policies against the press in the